My guest on this week's episode of Suds Search is Bartosz Goralewicz, CEO at Onely. Bartosz is an in-demand conference presenter and a frequent guest on industry podcasts and webinars. He is considered one of the top technical SEOs in the world. He's particularly knowledgeable about JavaScript SEO. A few places you might have heard Bartosz present include Ungagged, InOrbit, Brighton SEO, SearchLove, and all the different SMX events. For a really good deep dive into his areas of expertise, check out some of the webinars he's done for SEMrush. They are consistently excellent. Core Web Vitals has captured the attention of SEOs all over the world. I'm going to start our conversation by asking him a series of questions about Core Web Vitals and how he and his team approach the concept. I'm also going to ask Bartosz about JavaScript. Simply put, JavaScript and SEO don't play well together. How does an expert like Bartosz evaluate JavaScript for SEO? What JavaScript considerations should website owners and SEOs be concerned about? I'm going to ask Bartosz those questions and many more. Grab something cold to drink and join me for a conversation with Bartosz Goralewicz. We'll chat about how significant a change Core Web Vitals was. We'll chat JavaScript SEO. And we'll spend a little time talking about conference hijinks with Greg Gifford. All right, Bartosz, welcome to the Suds Search. How you doing?
Welcome, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm doing amazing. It's just nice to actually talk to someone face to face. Apart from our lovely customers, like and my team, I think this is one of those social situations we kind of miss sometimes.
I certainly do. Yeah, I really enjoy it, and it's a big getting you on. You have a reputation as one of the top technical SEOs in the world. You travel all over the place. And I'm curious, there's some kind of the hot topic in SEO right now, and certainly in technical SEO is Core Web Vitals. I wanted to ask you a little bit about it. There was this big update, I think it was like in May of this year. I'm curious, you are in this world, you were in this world beforehand. What fundamentally changed as a result of this update in May from someone who watches this very closely?
So first of all, thank you so much for all the kind words, Mark. I never know how to react, but then let's go straight into the geekiness. So, to be honest, I didn't expect Core Web Vitals to go this to be so popular. Yeah. Like, we started talking about this topic years ago, but then it wasn't even largest contentful paint. I forget the name. It was first. Contentful paint. Yeah, the first metrics around what now is called Core Web Vitals were extremely. Can we swear?
Sure. Yeah, by all means. Yeah.
No, they were just shit metrics. They wouldn't really tell you too much about the web performance. So when Google actually introduced, I think the first metric that I got excited about was largest contentful paint, because that seemed like a fairly logical choice. But what Google did, what gets me very excited, is they pulled this PR stunt of basically packaging what we used for years, maybe not years, but for a long time, into what they called Core Web Vitals, and basically said, okay, this might be a ranking factor, and that's it. Even though there are a lot of statements later on. And don't get me wrong, I'm not telling you not to focus on Core Web Vitals, but then Google said multiple times that even if it's going to be a ranking factor, it's not going to be anything to worry about. But just this one statement changed the whole World Wide Web. I find this fascinating, of how easy it is for them. So I think this is the most exciting part for me about Core Web Vitals, that Google got to change the whole World Wide Web with just a little bit of PR.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, I thought about it a little bit, and I don't know this as in depth as you might, but a lot of this stuff, Google's been telling us for a while, right? They've been telling us about HTTPS, mobile friendliness, page speed. You touched on largest contentful paint. What else is new? What are some of the new things that came out with Core Web Vitals, or is it just kind of packaging these concepts together?
So for me, what's fascinating still is, first of all, now we have the conversation. We actually have a conversation about web performance, because if you think about that, we can now say, okay, there was the whole World Wide Web was talking about those famous 2 seconds or
Right.
1 second for Amazon that's changing that by millions, whatever. Like this was a nonsense conversation. So it wasn't really very practical.
Yeah.
And now we have these 3 metrics, which seems fairly straightforward. So what changed is that how they package that. So we're not talking about page speed, which was a dreadful metric. It wasn't really measuring anything. Like I had this example. I think The Guardian was loading for 62 seconds, but you could interact with the content after a second.
Okay.
But still, the load time would be 60 seconds. So you would say, okay, this is a very slow website. And it was a very, I actually remember arguing with some of the SEOs about, like, why do you measure load time? Why do you use, like, GT metrics?
I was going to say, but there's all these tools out there, right? Like, what do you make of these? Google has a tool, had a tool about page speed, GT metrics. All these things are in, people are using them all the time. What do you make of these tools?
So yeah, this is this is so exciting, because if you look at that, we have a very broad history of word sheet as metrics. Page speed insights, the easiest metrics to fool that didn't even correlate with web performance for years. So you could have a website that would have a 100 PSI, and I remember talking to clients about it. I was like, your website is slow, and they would answer, okay, but we get this many points, or we get a pass with PSI, which I was close to a heart attack just trying to explain, like, if your website is slow but you have 100 points, like, do you still think it's fast? And what happened with Core Web Vitals? They changed the narrative, and I think for the first time in history we have a metric that we somehow agree on, or maybe if we don't, we kind of have to agree on it, and it actually measures something that we can see in our hands. So this is one thing. So for the first time in history, we can look at things that actually correlate with what we're seeing. But then how they structure that is kind of genius, because if we look at the layout shift, you may say, okay, they look at how an element is moving within the page. So layout shift is basically when you, for those within the audience who are not that techy, if you load the page, you want to click that button and it moves down or up or whatever. This is layout shift, the most annoying thing that was invented online. So looking into layout shift, and I think I have a prop somewhere. Sorry for the...
Won't be sorry, yeah.
Noise. So looking into layout shift, I need to slow down, I'm getting excited. So looking into layout shift actually changed how we look at... This is Alcatel 1X. So this is a phone that would freeze, the CPU would freeze completely when loading BBC, as an example. And this, for years, no one was like, okay, this might be a problem that my website, my news website, wouldn't load on a slower. This is not an old phone. This is bought, I think it's last year or 2 years old, for $100. Okay. It's just a cheap phone. This is $100 smartphone. So you would create, with how you design the website, you would exclude a part of the people. So you would exclude people with lower income, maybe older people using some kind of, those large brick kind of phones. So this wasn't very cool if you think about it. So Google managed to package quite a lot of different problems into those 3 metrics. So now when you design a website and it's full of JavaScript, full of CSS, full of different other problems, it's going to have huge layout shifts on slower phones. So if your audience is somehow using cheaper, smaller phones, so if your audience is kids, so you have like a meme website or whatever, or if your audience is older people with lower income, people in developing countries, like the one I'm from. So if you look at all these problems, the web wasn't very inclusive. So I think this is not something that's talked about that often. But this is one of the things I love, that we actually look at the whole range of problems rather than just, okay, let's load the page within 2 seconds.
Yeah, I like this so much. Like, this is similar to, I had it was Patrick Stocks from Ahrefs on. We were talking about Core Web Vitals. He made this point that it's like, it's for him, Core Web Vitals isn't principally an SEO consideration. It's like a user experience consideration more so. I don't know, a ranking signal. It's not a ranking signal for him. Do you see in your studies this big organic traffic increase or the typical SEO KPIs, really hockey stick after improving Core Web Vitals, or are there other considerations at work as well?
So, yeah, and this is a spectrum as well. So I'll try not to geek out, and this is usually tricky. But so if you look at that, if you look at the problem like the layout shift I just explained, to fix this problem, you need to address a couple of underlying issues, and one of these will be too much JavaScript. So if you look at that problem from the indexing and rendering point of view, you will have websites like famous website, maybe infamous website like Who.com or Angular.io, websites that historically went with a heavy JavaScript framework and got wiped out of the internet. Completely got completely de-indexed or partially de-indexed, and along with this problem that was somehow difficult to diagnose for them because people use, is this website, does the website work, rather than, is it, what about the technological depth and so on. So if you look at addressing Core Web Vitals for some of the very JavaScript heavy websites, like Walmart, we actually had a case study of Walmart where we showed, how you can improve that, like Best Buy. All those brands struggle with pushing so much code because they were focusing, is this code going to be working? Is it going to be improving user experience when we look at features rather than the real experience you're getting. So if you look at strictly Core Web Vitals, addressing these won't affect your traffic at all. There are multiple conversations. Some of those actually, I think we have recorded webinar with Martin Split where he obviously openly said that Core Web Vitals are not a major part of the ranking algorithm. So even if you go from being very slow to very fast, in theory, you shouldn't see a huge hockey stick trend, as you mentioned. But what ends up happening quite often when we work with clients, because we focus quite a lot of optimizing critical rendering path, which works for both a web rendering service at Google and Core Web Vitals, and how Google is going to index your content. So once we address these issues, Google is now able to pick up more content. And if you look at some of our research, on average, 26% of any website is not being indexed in Google, of indexable content. So these metrics ended up improving. So you would see 10, 15, 20% more content being picked up. And obviously, once Google picks up more content, you have more traffic. So this was a little bit of like a domino effect. So we were looking to Core Web Vitals, and they were saying, there are a little bit of issues with, a huge chunk of JavaScript code responsible for the slider, and just removing that will improve rendering and indexing and ranking. So and there are multiple shades of that that problem, but yeah. Let's pause.
No,
here.
that's great, and there's some things that you covered that I just want to make sure I understand, or that we don't go too fast for the audience. So let's say somebody. Somebody here is listening. They're like, okay, I'm into it. I want to know what my cumulative layout shift is, and I want to know what my largest contentful pain is. Where do they go? Where's that measured? What are the tools that are needed to do this job? How do you interpret the data from those tools?
Oh, that's such a bad question. I'm sorry. I'm such a bad person to answer that question because I'm using Chrome developer tools because they are like there is a tiny bit of the learning curve. Maybe you need to spend like 10-15 minutes just to figure out how to use that. But then you've got so many features. You can slow down your CPU to see, how is this brick gonna behave? You can change the resolution. So you've got multiple options. And then once the test is done, you can see which script was causing that and some other issues. So I would go with Chrome Developer Tools, but you mentioned people who are not that technical. For that, I would probably go with web page. I always get this name wrong. It's an open source tool, but I keep forgetting. I'll get back to that to this.
Well,
web page test, webpagetest.org. So this would be something I would go with. So either web page test or even PageSpeed Insights by Google. PageSpeed Insights is going to give you a ton of data from Crux. Okay. So this is something I would love. So maybe let's go into what Crux is, because I think this is also a huge game changer for the community. So Crux is Chrome User Experience Report, and it might sound geeky. So what Google did is they used their overwhelming power of owning Chrome and gathering data from us, so from real users, and they started gathering details about every single session from users and match those results with your domain. So basically, they know if you go to Amazon.com, they know what was your experience with Amazon.com, and why am I telling that? And I'm trying to keep it as simple as possible. Is then they publish this data, so you can actually access, let's say, real user metrics, so RAM metrics about your domain when you go to PageSpeed Insights, or there are multiple other ways to actually extract this data, and it's also available in Google Search Console.
Okay.
So what you can do, and how that actually how that's useful. Let's say that you have an international domain. Let's say you're owner of like IKEA or Zalando or I don't know, Amazon or anything that's somehow international. And let's assume you're using the same code and the same CMS or the same framework for each of those countries. And with this, you can see, okay, how real users in different places, as just one of the use cases, perceive my website. So you can see, okay, maybe in States, which is very iPhone dominant when you look at that, and iPhones have very strong CPUs, your website is working perfectly fine. So you can look at that as users living in States interacting with Amazon.com. It's very, very, very fast. But then you may go and see users in Malaysia, somewhere in, for example, Asia, where there are a lot of Android devices and like phones like Oppo or like niche, like what you would call as Americans, I would assume, or most of Europe, some kind of niche brands or different brands than iPhone. And you will see, okay, the same website, the same code is not performing this in the same way because of the CPU. Mm-hmm. But then it gets even more exciting with Crux, because you can say, okay, this website, looking at real users, is not performing very well in Australia. When, okay, users have very strong phones, but the coverage tends to be not amazing because of the size of the country. So you will leave the city and you lose 4G. So each of those countries will require a different kind of web performance consulting, optimization, So in Australia, you would actually ship less code, smaller images, or focus on some kind of approach of doing that. But in countries where the devices are not that amazing, you would actually have to get rid of some of the JavaScript features. So you would lose some of the animations, some of the moving parts, because the CPU is struggling, and so on and so on. So
Can I ask you a question?
But I can go on forever about that. So please stop me, Mark, if I geek out.
This is something, a lot of this stuff I have a decent amount of knowledge on, but this is honestly something I want to learn more about. when you talk about JavaScript and you talk about it in SEO, it's one of those like classic depends. It's like, is JavaScript good for SEO? Is it bad for SEO? And people always say it depends. It can be good. It can be rendered fine. It kind of rules of the road. I'm wondering on JavaScript. You've mentioned it many times in this conversation. Too much JavaScript, that it can hurt core web vitals, that it can hurt your technical SEO. Just conceptually, how do you look at JavaScript as an SEO?
This conversation went wrong a few times, but so SEOs hate JavaScript in general. So when you go on Twitter and you're gonna tweet right now, Mark is going on Twitter and it's like, I love JavaScript. You will have people saying like, you suck, like, leave the room. You will be cancelled on Twitter because of that. That might be the case, but I guess it's a little bit more complex than that. So JavaScript is not evil by no means, but I guess it wasn't introduced very well. So JavaScript SEO kind of happened, I would assume, around 2014-ish, give or take. But it was just maybe one or two publications, very technical publications, one by, I think, Eric Wu, a few other experiments by some other agencies. And then nothing happened. So in 2015, Google announced, and I'll keep this brief, that they are okay with rendering JavaScript just as any modern browser, which was the worst thing they could have done, because now in 2015, when this was announced and they discontinued the Ajax scheme, which none of you have, like, you don't have to, like, I'm talking to the audience, like, you don't have to understand what that means. Basically, Google said that they are okay with JavaScript. Right. And all of the webmasters, website owners, developers, they just heard that.
Yes.
And now you're seeing a flood of Angular power or React power or whatever websites flooding the internet. You've got Hulu losing tons of traffic because they're not being picked up by Google. You have all these huge brands failing miserably because they don't know how to deploy JavaScript completely, and there's no documentation.
Yeah.
So 2016 or 15, I don't remember correctly right now, but we launched an experiment just to address that somehow, because we're seeing one of our clients, we couldn't diagnose that for weeks. And then I have no idea how we did it, but we found that there was a little loader, like a loading cycling wheel in the middle of the website, blocking the whole render for Google. So we were like, okay, this had to happen to someone else. We Googled that, we searched the whole internet. Nobody was reporting those issues, but we saw Hulu, we saw a few other websites. We wrote articles about that. So long story short, this is why JavaScript has such a bad rap. Like, we published an experiment about that, Google. The next day or 2 days later, John Mellor created a group like this, kind of in 2016 with the experiment, and everything. Google started to pick up. Now we have Martin Split, mostly responsible for JavaScript, and so on. But now let me answer your question properly. Okay. So JavaScript is amazing because I don't think we could have the internet as we're using that today without it, including this call or anyone watching YouTube later on. But we need to divide JavaScript into two buckets. So JavaScript responsible for content. So no JavaScript, no content. This is a bad bucket.
Okay.
Content visible without JavaScript, but JavaScript at the same time being responsible for interactions, making the your user journey kind of nicer. Like, this is a good bucket, and that's it. Like, now we could finish, and we actually sent a valuable message, I think, about that. But now, what's happening and what seems to be a struggle is that developers launch a website with a dynamic content. So let's say New York Times is launching a client-side rendered, so JavaScript powered and client-side rendered websites. We'll get into what that means in a second. It's a very dynamic page. Rendering the JavaScript is going to take quite a bit of resources for Google. So just like this mobile phone is struggling with rendering the JavaScript, I'll explain rendering in a second, Google does as well. Okay. So now you can see that 2016, hundreds of thousands literally of domains launch heavy JavaScript code. And Google's servers, I'm assuming, still have the same computing power. So now you can explain. I think this tells the whole story, and I hope you understand why I took a little bit of a detour. But this caused the whole range of issues, because if Google had infinite resources, you can do whatever with JavaScript. They wouldn't care. They own Chrome, so they can render it. But the problem is that as this phone will struggle sometimes for 4 minutes to render some of the websites, this shows how much computing power is needed when Google is faced with billions of JavaScript powered websites. So, and one thing that what I need to state, Google can and will render JavaScript, but let's go into what rendering means quickly. Rendering means. So let's say you're going to you're going for a pizza. Okay. So with HTML, you get into the restaurant, you get a pizza. That's it. That's fairly simple. That's HTML. So with JavaScript, you walk into like Pizza Hut or whatever, and they give you all the ingredients, and you need to do it yourself. So that's JavaScript. JavaScript requires you or your user or your phone, or in case of Google, their web rendering service, to get all of the scripts, all of the elements of the code, process them, which is very CPU, so basically resource intensive, and then it spits out HTML. So in the end, it doesn't really matter if this is a JavaScript or HTML website. In the end, you have HTML. But with such a quick growth of JavaScript frameworks, not all of the developers, not all of the JavaScript developers, you probably know the problem with accessibility of good JavaScript developers in general. So not all of them have experience or knowledge, or they feel the need of launching JavaScript websites that have that extra layer of server-side rendering. So there's a server that processes the JavaScript into HTML. So this is an extra step. So you can do that, but you don't have to do it. And now we're faced with the problem. Let's say that Greg Gifford is launching his new website about beer. So he's got like gregsbeer.com. And he's got that dev team. They're like, okay, we're going to charge you like $20,000 for this JavaScript powered website, but it's going to be $27,000 if we do that server-side rendered. And we all know Greg. He's going to save that $7,000, and he's going to go with a CSR, so client-side render website. And this is where we see all of those controversies, all of those issues.
I see. Well, man, this is fascinating. This is a half hour just flew by talking to you. This has been amazing. I have to get in. I have to get in everyone's favorite part of the show, though. I feel like I'm shoehorning this in, but for you, this is where Greg gives me a question for the guest. He gives me no context to the question, so I don't know anything about this. It's a little bit of a high wire act for both of us, and for you.
It's gonna include iPhone for sure. I know.
So for you, he apparently Greg murdered you. Is there something here? There's a murder. Greg murdered you. That's the idea. Does that mean anything to you?
I don't know what that means, but my personal struggle, something I'm actually considering going to therapy, and after that happened to me, and it keeps happening to me. Facebook keeps thinking that I'm Greg. So when I publish my picture on Facebook, it's tagging my face as Greg Gifford, like whatever regardless of what I do, I'm actually considering unfriending him and blocking him on Facebook. So I can just imagine that this is the problem. We even looked into iPhones, and I was trying to unlock his iPhone with my face, but that didn't work.
I think the murder thing had something to do with a conference, like maybe on stage you came out in costume or something like that. Let's ring up.
Yeah, I actually don't remember the whole story. I'm guessing Greg has a better memory than myself, but I remember being dressed as Greg and just, I think, either opening a conference. I think he was keynoting Ungagged. Not 100% sure about that. I know it was Ungagged. And I would go out dressed as Greg, and someone would kill me. But I'm such a shit actor. I don't think I did a hell of a job with that. But yeah, like I think I went on stage at Ungagged Las Vegas, and I got killed. I forgot about that. That's right.
You may be a shit actor, but you're a very good podcast guest. This has been a really good conversation. Like, the time just flew by. I wish we had more time. Bartosz, if people want to get in touch with you or your agency, how do you like to do that? What's your favorite social media?
So yeah, just Twitter and onely.com. Just you can Twitter and Bartosz Goralewicz, which with my surname might be tricky. So I'm assuming only.com is easier. Also, thank you so much, Mark. I hope I wasn't mumbling too much about like these topics tend to excite me a little bit too much sometimes, but I really hope it was valuable.
I think it for sure was. Well, Bartosz, I'm going to sign off, or I'll give you a virtual cheers. And for everybody listening, we'll be back next week with another episode of Suds Search.